Mrs. Mouser Cat walked up to Aunt Amy with a mouse in her mouth. "This is the Mouser Cat's story. One day last week, when it stormed so very hard, your Aunt Amy was feeling very lonely. Mrs. Mouser Cat had all of her friends in the house, and it was busy. It wasn't a good idea for any of her bird or animal friends for Mouser Cat to be out. She sat by the window, watching the little streams of water as they ran down the glass. She said to herself this was one of the days when she could not hope to be entertained by storytelling. "You don't seem to care whether it's raining or not," a voice from the doorway said, and looking around in surprise, your Aunt Amy saw Mrs. Mouser Cat, an animal with whom she was very well acquainted, but who had never before tried to speak to her. She was astonished, because she never thought that Mrs. Mouser might prove to be as entertaining as any of the other animals she had talked with. Your Aunt Amy asked, "What about the rain, Mrs. Mouser? Why, cats don't like it when it's wet like that. Didn't you know that?" The cat replied, and your Aunt Amy said with a sigh, "Oh, yes, Mrs. Mouser, I know that, and you also know it is not possible for me to do any work around the house, since I am sick. That is why I am idle on this day when the storm makes it seem very, very lonely. You can sit outside all afternoon with a foolish old duck, or talk for an hour with Mr. Turtle, who hasn't got sense enough to go in when it rains, and yet you never invited me for an afternoon storytelling." Then Mrs. Mouser arched her back as if she was angry. "Do you know any stories?" your Aunt Amy asked, surprised again, and Mrs. Mouser replied quickly, "It would be funny if I didn't. I've lived on this farm more than 6 years, and have known pretty much all that has happened around here in that time. Why, cats catch mice." "I wish you could think of a story to tell me now," your Aunt Amy said. "I am just in the mood for hearing one. It is the hardest thing in the world to stand up and begin telling a story without anything to start one going," Mrs. Mouser said thoughtfully, as she brushed her whiskers with her paw. "After you get into it, of course they come easy enough. How about I explain why cats catch mice?" "Was there ever a time when they didn't catch mice?" your Aunt Amy asked, surprised for the third time. "Oh, yes, indeed," Mrs. Mouser said in a matter-of-fact tone. "All cats used to be good friends with the mice, once upon a time, and because an old Miss Kitty, who lived in the city, didn't have anything in the house to eat, the cats started catching mice. You see, it happened this way. A cat started catching mice. You see, it happened this way. A cat that was fat and lived in the country made up her mind one day to go and see her cousin in the city. Miss Kitty Cat decided to visit her cousin. She put on her hat and coat, wrapped some fried fish in a paper, and started her trip. When she got there, her cousin saw the fish, and it made her ashamed because she hadn't anything in the house to offer the visitor, so she asked, turning up her nose considerably, "Do you eat fish?" And Mrs. Kitty Cat replied, "Why, yes, of course we do. Don't you?" "Certainly not. I don't eat such yucky food." And then, remembering that she could not offer her cousin fish, she said, "We eat mice here. They are delicious. You would be surprised to know how tasty they are." That surprised the country cousin, and nothing would do but that she must go out hunting for mice. Of course, someone had to go with her, and then the city cat found she hadn't made a mistake after all. Mice or rats, take them any way you please, cooked or raw, are very nice indeed. The kitty the snow brought. "Do you think that is a true story?" your Aunt Amy asked. Mrs. Mouser replied, "I can't really say, but I think it is true that the snow brought a black cat to Miss Dolly." Your Aunt Amy knew Miss Dolly's kitten very well, but she had never heard anything about what Mrs. Mouser said. She was curious and asked her to tell her more. There is no mistake about it, Mrs. Mouser began. It was snowing one day, and Dolly, standing by the window, said that she wished the snowflakes would turn into a pretty little kitten to play with. She hadn't hardly more than spoken when they heard a cat calling from outdoors. Dolly ran into the hallway, believing the snowflakes had really turned into a pet for her. Now, it is kind of odd that when she opened the door, there stood a kitten, the same one we call Diamond. She was the cutest little stray kitten you could ever imagine, and as sparkly then as she is now, from her nose to the tip of her tail, but she was nearly frozen when Dolly took her in. They had to wrap her in a blanket and keep her near the fire 2 or 3 hours before she thawed out. I think that you and Diamond are not very good friends, your Aunt Amy said. Well, I can't say that we are, Mrs. Mouser replied thoughtfully. That sparkly cat has been petted so much that she really isn't of any very great service about the house. I don't believe she has caught a mouse in 6 months. I heard her tell Mr. Dolly's dog yesterday that she was more valuable around this farm than I am. Just think of it, and it has been proven that I have a good deal more sense than Mr. Fox, smart as he thinks he is. As a matter of fact, your Aunt Amy asked her what she meant, and Mrs. Mouser sat down at the fireplace, as if getting ready for an afternoon of storytelling. Then she said, I was down in the meadow looking for field mice one day and met Mr. Fox. You know, some animals think that I flatter Mr. Fox. He and I are friends. We have always been good friends. He sat down to chat and I said, Do you know, Mr. Fox, I think you are very smart. Well, now, would you believe it? That made him proud, and he said, grinning in a way that was enough to make any cat laugh, Indeed, I am, Mrs. Mouser. There isn't an animal around here who can hold a candle to me for smartness. What about the dogs? I asked, thinking to joke him a little, and he turned up his nose as he said, I don't give a snap of my claws for all the dogs there are around this place, even if 4 or 5 of them should come. Right up here this minute, it wouldn't bother me any. You may not think it, but Mr. Dolly is actually afraid of me. Well, do you know that made me laugh again because in the first place, I knew it wasn't true, but what was the use of saying anything of the kind to him? He was swelled with pride, so I changed the conversation and began talking about mice. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, and up came Mr. Towser, Miss Spaniel, and 4 or 5 other dogs, barking and yelping. Oh, me! Oh, my! How frightened I was! I scurried as fast as my legs would carry me, and not until I was safe on the highest limb did I look around to see Mr. Fox. He didn't like dogs, but he was going toward the meadow with his tail hanging straight out behind him. The dogs were gaining on him at every jump. Mr. Towser told me afterward that they made Mr. Fox as sick as Mrs. Toad made the bugs. What did Mrs. Toad do? Your Aunt Amy asked. Mrs. Mouser replied with a grin. Perhaps you never heard that Mr. Crow is really good at poetry. I have, your Aunt Amy replied, and it was hard to stop herself from laughing out loud. I've heard poetry from every bird and animal around this farm. Then perhaps you don't care to hear any more, Mrs. Mouser said inquiringly. Indeed, I do, your Aunt Amy replied. If it's not anything new, I have never heard of a wet weather party. Mrs. Mouser stroked her whiskers a moment, and then began to say, Mr. and Miss Cricket, a little ant was journeying home from a visit to town, when down came the rain, pitter-patter. It was so fast it threatened to spoil her best gown.